Okay, brilliant. Can you see my slides?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, so I'm here today to share key findings from some work my colleagues and I did in an accessibility and inclusivity subgroup. So just to give a little bit of context, Birkbeck's obviously known as the evening university, and about a third of our students are registered disabled or with specific learning difficulties. And obviously that's just those that are actually registered. So there's a great need for flexibility. A lot of our students have full-time jobs, caring responsibilities, and so on. So I'm sure some of you are aware, but in case you're not, HyFlex stands for hybrid and flexible. So students can study online, on campus, they can switch between the two. And in some offerings of HyFlex, there's also an asynchronous option, but Birkbeck doesn't offer that. So the creative inclusive learning, interestingly called KIL or SIL, prefer, project, was set up because we're implementing HyFlex teaching across most of the estate. So we're piloting HyFlex on a certain group of modules this year, and then we'll be rolling it out to more modules next year. But the accessibility and inclusivity subgroup was set up to help ensure that the challenges faced by our unique cohort were understood and solutions were developed to overcome them. Okay, so part of that work was then to run a student consultation. The selling point, or the way we kind of advertised it to students, was to help us work out how we could make HyFlex accessible to more students. So we had 3 micro teachers. Very kindly, academics offered to be a part of this. We had economics, foundation year, and marketing. There were 15 minutes micro teach followed by 5 minutes of stop, start, continue feedback. We wanted the lecturers to get something out of the consultation as well. So we requested that they were present for this feedback so they could get some pedagogical input. And then we had a longer, more open feedback session with just the A and I subgroup team members there with the students, focusing on the 2 questions which you can see on the slide. So what comments or initial thoughts do you have about learning in this environment, and what do you think could be done differently? We did have a couple of follow-ups, so thinking about opportunities and challenges for disabled and neurodivergent students, and also if there was preparatory training, what would you think would be useful to cover? There were quite a few themes that came out of the consultation. So if you'd like to see the full range, I can share that with you, but I've just focused on a couple for today. So obviously inclusivity was the massive draw. The students said you could really see how this HyFlex had the potential to really positively impact the way they could engage with their learning. It was seen as far more inclusive. It was much more synergistic. So if, for example, students couldn't come onto campus, they could still be really involved. It was much better than just simply watching a recording and catching up in that way. They also felt they could engage in a much more comfortable home environment, and they could personalize the settings on their laptops to their specific needs. So actually, during the consultation, a student shared with us that they had been stimming, but because they could turn off their camera, because they could turn off their mic, they were still able to engage with the consultation, but they had increased privacy and they could be a bit more comfortable in that, and they didn't miss out on anything. So as a result of that, the subgroup recommended that webcams for remote students are recommended, but not actually mandated. So it's really important. I know webcams, especially during COVID, has been really contentious. It's important for cohort building to have cameras on, but it's really important to also understand when and why you're going to use them. And that sometimes actually being able to turn them off can be really helpful. Okay, this one we had a lot of feedback on. So classroom management and tech management was a really key theme in the consultation. With classroom management, it was how to manage speakers, particularly in subjects which are very discursive, and also how to deal with visual information, particularly if you have blind or visually impaired students. And then tech management, so what happened again in discussions, how was chat going to be used, and also using screens. So one solution that can really cover a lot of those difficulties is actually setting a code of conduct and agreeing rules and etiquette. And this was also obviously put forth by the students. So actually setting etiquette for how students can enter discussions, how students can engage with chat, if chat's going to be used at all, but also actually just telling students what's HyFlex, because I think we sort of assume students have a lot of knowledge about what things are, and that's not always true. So actually giving a really clear explanation of what HyFlex is and what the expectations are can reduce anxiety and help with expectation setting. So one of the things that was suggested by the student in one of the students in the consultation was that staff could pay attention to when online students unmute their microphones or use the raise hand feature on Teams, because sometimes students are not comfortable just entering a conversation and interrupting the staff member. So actually, if there is rules and etiquette for how students can enter dialogue, such as physical hand raising or using the raise hand function, that can be really helpful, and it means everybody can join in. I think the chat function can be very contentious. Some students with learning difficulties said that it can be very overwhelming. It can be another form of input to have to pay attention to. And equally, actually, some staff have said that it's quite overwhelming because it's another thing that has to be managed. But actually, in the consultation, when Teams chat was used effectively, the students said that they were given time to respond to questions that were asked, and then those responses were directly answered. Okay, so moving on to obviously blocking visual information. It's really important when you have screens and you're displaying content, just making sure you know where you are and that everybody can see, but also avoiding moving content around. And within this, we suggested, so at Birkbeck, in one of the estates we've got 2 screens now. One of them we suggested making like a staff screen, so that might be where you display Teams, and the other one is specifically for students, so that's where you might put your content, like your PowerPoint slide or anything else you're using for teaching. The students said that when content was moved around quite a lot, it was really difficult to follow. So it's really important to try and be mindful of keeping the content fairly static. It's also, the students felt it also would be helpful if they were directed to which screen they could look at, so they're not trying to pay attention to too many things at once, and you can kind of minimize the input they're getting in that way. With regards to using a digital cursor or describing visual information, if you are using visual information, it's really important that you have a description for students that are visually impaired to accompany it. So rather than saying this section of the graph, that's not going to be as meaningful as if you say this X factor has decreased, why might that be, for example, rather than just assuming that everybody can see the visual content. A digital cursor is also helpful for all students, actually, directing them to where you want them to be looking. Okay, so I created a bit of an accessibility checklist that's quite helpful as a result of the student consultation, for staff to kind of think about. Some of these I've already covered, but there's a couple here I'll just go over. So thinking about how students participate in discussions, it's quite helpful for visually impaired or blind students that if students join in a conversation, that the speaker announces who they are before speaking, so that the visually impaired or blind student knows who they're referring to if they want to refer to something that's been said. With rating scales, rather than using the typical smiley face, sad face, just for students with cognitive impairments, it can be really helpful to make sure those rating scales or those symbols are actually interpretable, so not always relying on facial expressions. And making sure captions are enabled. So when I mentioned earlier, students can really personalize their settings, that's great. But if you have a deaf or a hearing impaired student in your class, if you don't put the captions on the screen, that can often mean they then have to put on their own laptop, they're stuck behind their own screen, and that can create a barrier. I'm very aware I am now at 10 minutes. So what I'll do, so we have time for questions, I've also got a summary of sort of practical applications that I'll just put up on the screen. And if anybody would like me to talk through any of them, I can, or you can just have a look at them while I answer questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We've had a few comments in the chat already. I particularly like Lindsay's comment in the chat there. So HyFlex is patting the head while rubbing the tummy while saying the alphabet backwards. I thought that's very good. I guess if it's okay, I had two questions that I was going to ask, and then if anyone does have any questions, if you could stick them in the Q&A or raise your hand, and we'll see how we go. So in terms of the module or the kind of the people that were doing the HyFlex, what were the numbers? What were the size of the groups that you were working with, or the staff were working with?
We have limited HyFlex classes to about 30 students because we felt that in order to get the interactivity that was needed, it's not something that we felt in our context would work because we didn't want to just end up doing live streaming. So yeah, the limit was set at 30.
And is that so in terms of when you offered this as an option, I'm assuming, do you let students choose which way they wanted to go, or did you put students into groups and say, oh, on this day you're going to be in person, but this day you can be online? How did that work?
That's a good question. I think the students could choose whether they wanted to be online or in person. There are some restrictions, for example, with UKVI and US federal loan. But if HyFlex is offered and students are eligible to study HyFlex, they can choose. And we haven't said that they have to let lecturers know. I think if they want to, it's obviously helpful, but the premise has been very much that you may not know what the balance of your cohort is going to be. So it's kind of preparing for that eventuality, really.
And kind of following on from that, it's what were the kind of, was there like an average proportion that you saw where students like 40% would be in person or 40% would be online, or if there were any kind of trends like that you noticed?
I will be able to comment more on that probably in about a week's time because we've just started getting our evaluations back. So I think it's quite mixed. So this is hypothetically, I expect that we may see a balance, possibly more to online. And I think as we get into assessment season, there may be an increase. But actually, that's something I could probably comment more realistically on in a short period of time.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. And we do have a couple of questions. So Mike has asked, can all staff do HyFlex?
If they're on, we've said if they're on the pilot, of course, and I think the way it was done was that staff could put forth modules they wanted to run HyFlex or they felt would run effectively HyFlex. We haven't really run into any situations. Well, there are a couple of things we felt wouldn't work as HyFlex. So, for example, with wet labs. But in general, if staff have expressed an interest and also there's been a commitment, we've asked that staff commit to the development program, which covers introducing what HyFlex is in Birkbeck's context, designing and adapting for HyFlex, and then also a practical. So we go through how to use the tech. So we have requested if staff are interested in going onto the pilot, there's just this commitment to the training, really.
Okay, so that was kind of another question I was going to ask, was the training. You had that great checklist that I really liked around accessibility, but I can just imagine that if that was just sent to an academic or anyone teaching, that would be quite a tricky thing to be able to pull off without any training. So I was just going to ask what the training involved. Was it like a one-to-one session, or was it kind of online training that you provided, or how did that work?
We offered it HyFlex. Yeah, I think that actually relates really interestingly to the comment about patting the head, rubbing the belly, because there are a lot of moving parts. So when the DigEd team did the development program, we thought, okay, we need to break this down because we've got some staff who had been doing a version of HyFlex, kind of trying it out. But then we wanted to think, okay, what do we want HyFlex to look like at Birkbeck? And then based our training around that. So the first session, Intro to HyFlex, we targeted tried to find a middle ground. So again, some staff were really confident with doing a mix, I guess, more hybrid teaching, and other staff were coming in with no experience at all, or having not been in the classroom for a while, because our university is quite research heavy and the tech had changed in that time. So really trying to introduce the pedagogy of it, so get a good groundwork before we moved into the design elements and bringing in how could you adapt your module if it's a module that's already been taught but is now on the HyFlex pilot. How can you adapt elements of your teaching to fit in a HyFlex mode before the last bit, which is the practical? So we've said, bring in a task that you would like to try out HyFlex in your class, and we'll go through it in the practice session. So we would have a couple of members of the DigEd team there. They would be shown how to set up the tech. We also, our team does a lot of fantastic work with classroom tech training anyway, but this also gave them a chance to run through something they wanted to do with a member of the DigEd team there. And if there was another one of us there, we would kind of be the students, so we could give them feedback on what was working and how it looked.
That sounds really great, really powerful, actually. Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Thank you. I could continue to ask questions around this because it's something I'm really interested in for probably another hour or so, but I think we're probably going to have to call it time there today. So thank you so much for joining us, Pip.